must push forward. I am giving you my most honored, elite warriors. Use them to secure this victory.
Welcome to Warthunder Naval. I am Commander Tyrael, and this is IJN Myoko, the lead ship of the Myoko class of heavy cruisers, one of the many unique cruiser designs found in the Japanese tech tree. Japanese heavy cruisers are generally defined as fast, light and maneuverable with hard-hitting 8-inch batteries. Their main drawbacks being slow gun traverse speed, light armour, and a vulnerability to fire and detonations, offset to a small degree by good accuracy and heavy shells with high explosive filler. Japanese warships outside of the capital fleet generally cannot compete in a straight gun battle against other destroyers and cruisers, and this may seem like a major disadvantage, but this was never the intention behind their design or use. Japanese cruisers were built with a specific enemy in mind, designed to fight under a specific doctrine, the KANTAI KESSEN, or Decisive Battle Doctrine. The Imperial Japanese General Navy staff were heavily influenced by the writings of American naval historian Alfred Mahn. Mahn's writing described how British naval power in the Age of Sail had made the British Empire dominant over its rivals and kept it secure. As Britain and Japan were both island nations, the Japanese Navy General Staff felt the British maritime experience was useful and relevant to their future. Mahn asserted that the objective of a strong sea power was to build a fleet capable of destroying the enemy's main force in a single battle line. By concentrating her ships in a powerful force, the British were able to win decisive victories. Once accomplished, Britain was at liberty to blockade her enemy's ports. Concentration was the key element. In 1896, the Japanese introduced the Naval Expansion Plan, and Japan began building 4 battleships. They were more powerful in armament and armour than any other warship ever afloat. This effort provided the Japanese Navy an advantage over other naval powers and became the hallmark of future Japanese planning.
Excellent, Commander. You bring great honor to your family.
Japan's primary goal after World War I was to expand its economic influence and control in the East Asia, principally China. In that strategic aim, they faced opposition from Britain, the Netherlands, and the United States, which sought to maintain an economic open-door policy. In this setting, the naval planners of both Japan and the United States began working out scenarios for how the possible conflict in the Pacific would be fought and won. While there are many differences between the Japanese and United States navies, there were many parallels between them as well. Both had last engaged in active warfare at the turn of the century. Both navies won all of their major engagements that they fought. The decisive element in the American victories was the naval gun, while the Japanese recognized the potential of the torpedo and the naval mine. Both navies saw the vast Pacific as the cage in which a decisive naval war would be fought. The United States, Great Britain and Japan began a naval arms race by planning and starting bigger and bigger battleships. This culminated in the Washington Treaty of 1922, which limited the total tonnage of the major powers' battle fleets, imposed size limits on new warships, and stopped the building of new battleships. In general, the agreement permitted Japan to build a battle fleet of about 60% the size of the United States fleet. Within the constraints of the time, the interwar Japanese Navy set out to design and build the cruisers and destroyers which would fight the Second World War in the Pacific. In doing so, they recognized that any design would be a complex balancing act. Should many small ships be built, or should relatively fewer larger ships be built? Should guns or torpedoes be emphasized, or should they be balanced? Should speed be sacrificed for range, or range for speed? Or both for armor? To resolve these dilemmas, ship designers turned to their conception of the battles these ships would fight. Their designs grew from their doctrines. Japan's doctrine grew from the vast distances of the Pacific. These distances are immense. Japan lay 3,400 miles from the US fleet base at Pearl Harbor. This vast distance suggested to the Japanese strategist a way to win the war. While the Japanese acknowledged the greater war-making potential of the United States, they had blooded themselves fighting a larger power to a standstill before. If Japan could battle Russia to a negotiated settlement when their navy could not even be built domestically, then why couldn't the Japanese, a stronger, more self-sufficient Japan, do the same to the United States? Japan's strategic plan was based on these axioms: strike hard and strike first, secure maximum resources, establish a defensive perimeter and fight a war of attrition against advancing forces over large distances, Finally, fight a decisive battle against an exhausted enemy at the end of their extended supply lines. To carry out this strategy, the Japanese developed a doctrine which emphasized the individual superiority of Japanese warships. They could be outbuilt, but they hoped to maintain a qualitative edge over their opponent. The Japanese gambled their ambitions and their doctrines on the idea that superior ships could defeat a greater number of smaller ships. If that theory was incorrect, the Japanese had lost their war before it had even begun. The result was a navy that relied heavily on its destroyer force being able to take down capital ships during a time when it was unclear whether such a thing was possible. To combat this disadvantage, the Imperial Japanese Navy developed a strategy in which a series of mass torpedo attacks would weaken the US fleet ahead of its major battles. For this to work, the IJN experimented with oxygen torpedoes, resulting in the Type 93 Model 1 Mod 1 torpedo. This torpedo gave the Japanese an advantage that went unnoticed until 1943. In the envisioned maelstrom of naval gunnery, conventional doctrine gave torpedo-firing destroyers a subsidiary role. They would engage their opposite numbers, finish off cripples, and cover the maneuvers of the battle line by laying smoke and launching torpedoes in defense. The Japanese saw things very differently. They designed their forces into squadrons of destroyers as escorts for cruisers, whose primary role was to scout for enemy forces and cause maximum damage from range. The standard squadron formation was a single column of 2 cruisers and 4 destroyers, more where possible. Cruisers were to provide gunfire support for destroyers as they closed the distance for torpedo attack. If battleships or cruisers were present, then the cruisers were to launch their own torpedoes against these units. Cruiser guns were only to be used on light enemy forces, with cruisers using torpedoes against light surface combatants only if a tactical opportunity presented itself. Action plan was divided into 2 groups, day actions and night actions, with Japanese crews thoroughly drilled in night operations. Each action had 4 possible plans. Plan E: all forces close swiftly and destroy the enemy decisively. Plan Rho was to draw the enemy out, fire torpedoes secretly from max range, with a normal swift assault by all forces once the torpedoes arrived at their destination. Plan Ha: long range frontal engagement at dawn or dusk to transition the fight to a day or night action. And finally, Plan Ni: avoid a test of strength and wait for the enemy to drawn out by friendly forces before engaging. The cruisers were responsible for screening the battle force and reporting positions, which is why their cruisers carry a large variety of scout aircraft. Standard firing ranges for heavy cruisers against battleships, heavy cruisers and carriers was 25 kilometers. It was 15 kilometers versus light cruisers and 12 kilometers versus destroyers in range, with 17 kilometers being the optimum firing range for plunging fire to do serious damage to large surface combatants. I could go on all day about this doctrine, but how does it relate to Warthunder? Now we know a few things from what's just been stated. Japanese tactics revolved around maximum range gunfights with liberal use of torpedoes, using speed to dictate when and where a fight will happen. Distance helps increase the armor protection against smaller caliber fire and maximizes the strength of Japanese heavy shells, and gives opportunities for uncontested torpedo kills. In games, we aren't always able to capitalize on these strengths due to map design, lack of night battles, and engagement starting ranges, but keeping the doctrine in mind, we can see that Japanese heavies need to be played like backline hunter-killers, hitting the target first with their devastating 8-inch guns and keeping the enemy under duress until they are done for. Once local superiority is achieved, pushing in to finish the enemy decisively. Designed to duel other cruisers, this should be your primary mission, if you want to win games. The long lances should always be used from long range, always keeping 1 or 2 for close range opportunities. The reloads can be a liability and cause brutal explosions if you're hit. If these doctrines are followed, usually you can defeat Brooklyns and other 6-inch cruisers, providing you hit them first and try to single out any stragglers from the main fleet. Minimizing your aggro is the key to surviving in a Japanese cruiser. It's often wise to lay your torpedoes before engaging and selecting a gunnery target. Always respond to an aggressor and focus them down. At battleship tiers, the torpedo becomes your primary weapon against battleships, with gunfire reserved for cruisers only. Playing them like a destroyer at this level can be beneficial, launching ambushes and trying to gain a tactical and positional superiority. Each cruiser has a different float plane, so become familiar with their mission and utility. IJN Miyako, for example, has two F1M1s, which have no bombs but are very fast, and are best used as fighters to defend your ship against air attacks and lock down other slower moving scout planes, as well as for spotting the enemy headings and fleet compositions and planning your next move. Japan has a huge amount of diversity in gameplay style compared to the Western navies, but requires players to acknowledge that difference. Out of all the cruisers, Japanese heavy cruisers perform reliably and play very similarly. They have fast-firing 8-inch guns on par with the Admiral Hipper class, with more explosive filler and longer fuses, allowing their AP shells to penetrate deep into the bowels of their enemy. Japanese heavy cruisers on paper are superior to nearly every other nation's treaty cruisers, and this is a reflection of the doctrine, with many ships either breaking the treaty requirements or being built with upgrades in mind, with the Mogami class as a perfect example of this, built with 155mm guns, with 203mm being the actual intended armament. If you can master this playstyle, you will be rewarded with a collection of the finest battleships and battlecruisers in the game. While Warthunder meta is more tuned to 6-inch gunplay at close ranges, Japanese players also have a fine selection of aircraft to support their lineups, and can do exceedingly well in naval enduring confrontation, especially the arcade version with long lance reloads. Additionally, Japan does well in standard arcade, often topping the table with insanely powerful arcade buff torpedoes. Their biggest weakness is probably their AA armament, always 25mm and always scattered all over the ship, often in single and double mounts. They don't offer the density of fire of other nations, and Japanese AA is more like a wall of needles. The enemy often get close enough to hurt you, despite taking substantial damage themselves. I hope this gives you a better insight in how to make the most of Japanese cruiser line. Being an Australian, I have a profound respect for what the Japanese were able to do with the technology and resources available to them at the time. They were a real threat, and they fought with a unique form of ferocity. Would you like to know more? Check out my IJN Torpedo Doctrine video to see how to use this formidable weapon in action. And make sure to subscribe to the channel to catch all of the latest intel. Until next time, Commander Tyrael, out.
Excellent work, Commander. Our rise to world domination has now begun.